Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Credible Challenge and the Quest for EUC Excellence. Today, we're joined by Craig Haddabaugh, CEO at SimCon Software. SimCon Software is an expert in spreadsheet accuracy and EUC self-governing controls. We've helped hundreds of companies, large and small, gain error-free spreadsheets and dramatically reduce their EUC risk through automation software. Craig, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. Take it away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, our focus is on the risk professional in the second line of defense, and we're going to talk about two core elements that constitute credible challenge. I mean, ultimately, what's credible for one company is different than for another, so it's a unique standard. But we're going to share our opinions on two core elements that we think are fundamental and should be part of any credible challenge endeavor. So with that, as we know, spreadsheets have been around for a long time, so it's easy to become numb to the risk, but it's still worth pursuing as the stakes are high. One of the stories I'll tell shortly underscores that event. And as we get into the foundations, there's really two, although doesn't seem right that there's two foundations. There's really two core elements to the foundation for effective challenge, and we're going to talk about some practical elements of policy. We're going to touch on the core requirement for inventory. We're not going to go into detail on inventory, but certainly touch on how it fits in the context of making credible challenge. We'll talk about the ability to implement some basic controls even without the use of software, whether it's from SimCon or one of the other suppliers in this area, all the way through what are the options open for you to follow a formal RICSA process to really assess the current state of the risk and fully document the gaps, shortcomings, inherent risk versus residual, et cetera. Touch very briefly at the end, just one slide on the options to leverage technology. And then, as Leslie said, we'll open it up to questions at the end. So with that, again, I think in our observations and our work with many, many different companies, there's somewhat of a complacency around spreadsheets, to the extent that a company has a specific issue identified, something's been called out by an auditor or a regulator, the emphasis and focus is much sharper. But in general, if there isn't some exterior forcing function, then there's generally a complacency that sets in around. But, I can assure you this risk remains very real, and the impacts can be material. So there's very many well-documented cases of spreadsheet errors becoming public, and for the public companies leading to share price declines. In terms of disruptions to operational impact, very often if an end-user controlled file, let's say a spreadsheet, is corrupted by malware and becomes unavailable until, the ransom is paid, that can have a big impact on operations and people can't get their work done. I mean, there's been examples of police departments paying the ransom in order to get their operations running again. I've often argued that when it comes to compliance, that compliance is secondary to, the prevention and reducing the likelihood of errors. But, GDPR, as it comes into play in just a few days now, really changes that equation a little. It doesn't alter it fundamentally, but obviously the risk of fines for losing PII and being in violation of those regulations are becoming high, and most companies in their struggle to comply have focused on the big transactional systems and enterprise databases, but not a lot of companies have had the time and resources to look at the unstructured data, the data that may be residing in all these various end-user controlled files, so it remains a liability. And then the big thing about EUC errors is that the impact can be immediate. So if you have an MRA, you have some period of time, whether it be months or maybe even a year or so, to try to address those issues. But when there's a material error that impact is immediate. And I think in our last webinar, I mentioned the case of Conviviality in the UK, which had a material error in a forecasting spreadsheet. That error was really kind of the catalyst or the igniter for a series of events that ultimately led to the company going into receivership within 30 days of the public disclosure of that error. And when you think about that, as part of that process of them, going into receivership, within 2 weeks of the error being publicly announced, the CEO was forced to step down. And so in the context of that, if the CEO's job isn't safe, then nobody's job is safe. So EUC risk, as innocuous as it may seem, and as used to it as we may have all become, it's still out there. And again, when something small happens, things can go bad in a very big and very quick way. So again, every company has EUC risk. For those who have seen some of our previous webinars, you've seen this slide before. These are the files under end user control. So they're not managed by the IT group, and they're not falling under the umbrella of the standard IT risk management processes. Often this focuses on models because of a regulatory requirement, but there are certain tools and spreadsheets that have an equal magnitude of risk. And, from a quantity perspective, while there's lots of different types of end-user controlled files, we track about 24 different types. By far and away, Excel spreadsheets are the #1 type of file, and that's why most companies, when they choose to focus on managing EUC risk, quickly drill into focusing on spreadsheets. So I was working with a company once who was evaluating our technology, and the director of operational risk told me, hey, I understand that this stuff is risky, but it's not a problem until it's a problem. And, basically was saying, hey, I acknowledge the risk, but if something goes wrong, then we'll deal with it then and try to pick up the mess or clean up the mess or pick up the pieces. And, I don't know for certain, but from everything I could tell, that was really just a basic assumption. There'd been no analysis of the inherent risk, and since they clearly didn't have any controls in place and admittedly didn't have any controls in place, the residual risk was equal to the inherent risk, but they were just assuming, something happens, we'll deal with it. And, as the Conviviality case shows, that's not a good assumption. Bad things can happen when small errors or other mistakes happen in regards to end-user controlled files. So in terms of getting started, it's nothing new for us to say that you need a policy or a standard. I mean, you must have an objective basis on which to make your challenge to the first line of business. And it's difficult sometimes. We often comment that it's end-user computing for a reason. The people in the line of business have chosen to build, design, test, control these files for whatever their motivation may be, whether it's agility, speed, control of their own destiny. And when you approach them and say, hey, let's talk about getting some risk management practice process in place here, you might be, met with surprise, like, why? This is my application. Why are you bothering me? So you need some type of policy or standard, corporate agreed standard, to back up your challenge. And it doesn't have to be long. Typically when customers share these with us under NDA, they're anywhere from 8 to 12 pages. But when you look at the core, actionable, practical side of those documents, it's really just a couple pages. So if you don't have a policy, you can certainly build one. And again, it doesn't have to be big and fancy. You can just focus in on a few core standards and associated controls. So you can build that from scratch if you don't have one, or you can graphed onto an existing standard. Most often we see it's the information security or information governance policy. You know, almost every company has that. It's really rare to see that people would not. So you can, if that doesn't incorporate specific standards or procedures around EUCs, that's a good place that you could amend. And again, you don't have to amend 10 pages to it, but maybe, you know, a half a page or a page of controls and procedures that are specific to EUC and help you get a better handle on this risk. Just a comment toward the end, there's lots of companies that can help you with policy. We are not expert on policy or putting governance frameworks in place. We're experts in developing software and helping map that software to your policy, which is why companies share them with us. But there's lots of firms out there that can help you, whether it's the bigger firms like the KPMGs, Grant Thorntons, Protivities. Those firms have dedicated people in the risk management practice, and they can help if you choose to seek that out in regards to your policy. So when we think of, you know, there's policy as a piece of paper, and then there's policy as its practice out in the field. And the really two core elements are looking at an EUC and understanding, is it part of a critical business process or not? It's pretty simple. It is or it isn't. And if it is, you know, what process is it and who owns it? The next step is looking at that and just saying, you know, are there any controls defined? You know, if there are some controls, are they on the minimum end of the spectrum or are they on the maximum? You know, for most companies that we work with, we typically see few, if any, controls in regards to EUCs. The larger companies have them, but the smaller to medium companies that have an equal, you know, kind of a relative or proportional same degree of risk, even though they're smaller in scale, they typically don't have any controls. So, you know, look at this and understand critical, yes or no. If yes, are there any controls? And if there are none, consistent with what we were speaking about earlier in terms of the information security policy, see if there's a way to blend in with some of the existing controls, let's say around data classification and you know, the labeling of end user files in regards to their degree of sensitivity or proprietary, you know, the proprietary nature of the content within them. And, you know, often we see, you know, the old joke about hope is not a strategy. You know, as I shared the example of the director of op risk before, where basically it was, hey, we'll wait and see, and if we have an error, then we'll deal with it then. And if that's the case, you know, ultimately the first line owns the risk, and you can't tell them what to do, but you certainly can make someone aware of the fact that here's a file, an application, it's used in a critical business process, there are no controls on it, you willing to accept that risk or not? You know, that decision needs to be elevated. So EUC risk doesn't hide per se, doesn't actively go out and hide, but it can actually exist in lots of different places. So there's the classic use cases of it's some type of tool or calculator, it's producing some type of result, you know, frequently used in financial reporting in almost every company, small or large. You know, again, the degree to which it's used varies. Some are totally dependent and some are hardly dependent at all, but almost everyone has a dependency. So those use cases, that particular use case is relatively easy to spot or to discover. But how about the case where there's an extract coming from the enterprise database, or you're taking extracts from two databases, putting them into Excel, manipulating it, and then passing it on to something else. Maybe it's another model that's feeding a model. And so those cases where you've got Excel as part of the data supply chain, if you will, those are much harder to find. And but it's every bit as critical. If that data gets, if the integrity of that data somehow gets compromised as it passes through that spreadsheet, then you've got major problems and susceptibility to error and potentially fraud. In terms of models, again, usually because of the regulatory aspects of financial services, there's a decent amount of attention paid to models. But some of those models are built in Excel, some are built with scripted apps. So, end-user controlled models are a subset of the broader model population. And then there's the situation where you have sensitive information, whether it's someone's personal information or their health information, stored in an office file. And this happens a lot more frequently than people think. And, that's a huge risk. We'll talk about that a little more, and especially with the onset of GDPR, that's an important area to pay some attention to. So the second core component or element of your foundation is an inventory. Again, many people are familiar with model inventories, so the concept isn't new, but ultimately you can't challenge or measure what you can't see. If you have no idea what files to look at, and one of the challenges of EUC risk management is that there's literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions or tens of millions of these files, is what are the ones that we should pay attention to? Because it's typically a very, very tiny fraction of the total population of these file types. So most lines of business will have a preliminary list, and that's a starting point. So if they know and have some informal way of keeping track of, what the critical files are, again, that's a good place to start on your challenge. And even the metadata, i.e. the data about the list is of value. So for example, if there was 43 tools that were in their inventory in a financial reporting group, and every year that number doesn't change, doesn't get bigger or doesn't get smaller, then something's probably up in terms of that list not being kept up to date. So even the data about the list itself has some value. And the inventory should tell you where, not physically where the file is stored, although, ultimately you'll get to that, but that's the easy part. The harder part is what business process is affected. Does this affect our financial reporting? Does this affect our regulatory filing? Does this affect the calculation of the field sales force incentives? Does this affect our tax liabilities? All of those areas are business processes, and if there's a spreadsheet dependency, that should be known. The second key thing the inventory should tell you is the who. Who is the person in the first line who's accountable and owns this file? So I mentioned, in April, on the website, you can go back and look at the details of EUC inventory and best practice. We spoke for a half hour just on that topic. But, the key elements in quick review is you have to have objective standards. For those on the more sophisticated side of the spectrum, you have multi-factors in terms of determining the risk rating. You should automate wherever possible. To the degree that you can automate and minimize the input burden on the line of business and minimize your burden in terms of reporting and in the risk function, the more you can automate and the more the updating process and the semi-annual or annual touch process is triggered by an email that automatically goes out to the owners. The more you can do that type of thing, the more sustainable your risk management process becomes, and the higher the probability that it will continue and maintain its effectiveness. So in terms of just kind of summing up these 2 points in making a challenge to the first line, again, clearly you have to have an inventory. You need to understand the business process that's affected and the actual person or persons in the line of business who are accountable. And then in terms of controls, are there any controls? If yes, then you can move on to step 2, which is trying to understand, are they effective and consistent with policy? Can they be improved? Can you in the second line function help them improve those controls? without overburdening the people who actually have to get their work done. And as you approach this, again, if you recall what I had talked about earlier, you know, initially people might be reluctant, like, hey, this is my file, this is my app, you know, why are you sticking your nose in here? You know, there's kind of two ways you approach it. So one is to explain, hey, look, here's how things can go wrong. Here's how it can hurt you personally in terms of your career, or it hurts the company. Or you can come at it from the angle of, you aren't being compliant to policy, and I'm here to help you become compliant. You know, I can assure you that the first path typically yields much better results than the second path. So in terms of leveraging technology, again, SimCon's in the business of providing this type of technology. So one thing technology can do is it brings objectivity to a highly subjective area. If any of you on this call have been involved in the debates as to what's a model and what's not, you know, those almost can border on religious type arguments as people try to say this is a model or it isn't. And that same ambiguity can, you know, transfer over as you start looking at critical EUCs of other file types. So having some objectivity, understanding this file has a definitive amount of macro code, and by policy, it's now complex and it's going to go under some form of control. That's one example of something that technology can tell you. In terms of when you look at network drives, file share scanning technology, having the ability to assess millions of files in an hour is important. Again, when you're talking about end-user controlled files, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of these files, and it's literally impossible to look at them manually. But there is technology out there that can help you assess and kind of prioritize, do a triage, if you will, as to what are the more important files that we should look at and focus on, you know, from a manual basis. Obviously, there's implementing the basic controls like access. If it's a critical file, operations are dependent on it. The impact is high if there's a mistake. You should be limiting who has access to that file, who has rights to change that file. In terms of workflow processes, automating workflow tends to be a more advanced topic. Not everybody does that, but that capability can be facilitated through technology. There's the more advanced controls that become more preventative and in reality or in truth are more restrictive on end users, but again, those can be implemented through technology. And then finally, the process of keeping the inventory current and up to date. Again, imagine a situation where if you're doing that manually, someone has to chase down the owners, has to get them to fill out a form or make some type of attestation that the data is current, whereas imagine a system that had automatic email notifications going out to each owner. There was a web link, people click on the link, update a system that sits up in the cloud somewhere, all the data flows, end user is done, people in the risk function can just run their reports at a corporate level. So there's lots of ways technology can help. Again, this is the core focus of SimCon as a company. If you have interest in that, you can contact us. So again, we can't emphasize this enough, and for those of you who have had to endure me speaking before, you've seen this slide before, and it's just so important because, you know, we see the imbalance all the time, especially in the first phase of implementing EUC risk management. Typically, the second line will overshoot the runway and come in kind of too heavy or too hard and lower the boom. And then there's a lot of pushback from the line of business, regroup, go back, and then, you know, put in some controls and some responsibilities on the line of business, some processes on the line of business that are more reasonable and are more balanced. And this balance is key because if you don't have it, the process is unsustainable. Maybe you'll get compliance once, but over time, it will drift, and then the ultimate objective of reducing the risk won't be achieved. So that really sums up what we were going to talk about today. Again, we would welcome the opportunity to have a discussion with any of you on the line who want to understand more about what can or can't be done with the tools that you have, or you'd like to understand what technology could do to help you improve some of these manual risk management process and be a little more effective in the way that you mitigate these EUC risks. So we're always ready and willing to have that conversation. You know where to find us in terms of our website, and you can feel free to email me personally. There's my email address, and I'll make sure that someone gets back to you. So on our website, we do have a free version of a personal inventory tool, and it kind of mimics what can be done at scale on a network drive or a SharePoint repository, but it gives you a feel for some of the type of information that you can get from the really rapid, fast scanning. And then we're going to, everyone who's registered for the webinar, we're going to send you a short 90-second video that talks about our new inventory management product that is true software as a service, resides on the cloud. If you choose to subscribe to such service, you can have your inventory up and running within an hour of signing an agreement with us. So again, we'll send you a short 90 seconds on that and take it from there. So with that, we're definitely coming up at the end of our half hour here.